My name's Alex McClelland, and I'm here with my colleague and co-conspirator Zoe Dodd, and we're going to present some of our work today. Before getting started, I wanted to invite Erickson to Glad Day Bookshop Shopping so he can tell us a little bit about the space that we're in today.
Thanks. Hi everyone. I'm doing a little Glad Day around. So you're actually, the space you're in right now is above Glad Day Bookshop, which is on the second floor. Glad Day is the world's oldest trans queer bookstore. It's also Toronto's oldest surviving bookstore of any kind, I realize. Which is like good news, bad news, right? And I guess maybe I'll pitch our campaign. So some of you might know, we're moving to Church Street. Soon, like really soon. Expensive because we're going to actually change our model in order to afford like ground level rent and consumable. So we're going to be like a coffee shop in the daytime, dance parties on the weekends, books all the time. So it's going to be great. It should go for like performances and way more community conversations, that kind of stuff. It's not a huge space, but it's big enough to do some of those things. But of course, it's pretty to like set up a bar and a coffee shop and do renos and stuff. So we do have an Indiegogo campaign on for a few more days. So the more we can get through from like donations, the better. The more we can do the renos we need for the space. And we have, you know, out of desperation, we take loans to make this happen. And so the faster we can get rid of that, the more stable we're going to be going forward. So we're going to release the name of the space tomorrow, which might surprise some of you, so it'll be kind of exciting. And hopefully we'll have the same.
Bad day.
Yeah. Exactly right. Yeah. Oh my God. Yeah. So hopefully we can have like this kind of conversation in that space going forward. It has air conditioning. It's very exciting, and of course it's wheelchair accessible, and we'll have an accessible washroom too. Shortly after we go, which is great. Thanks, guys.
So hi. Okay, so first of all, before we get started, we would like to acknowledge that we are on treaty in Haudenosaunee word and has been site of human habitation for over 10,000 years. This land we stand on has played host to multiple distinct peoples in its pre-colonial history, so including Anishinaabe, Huron, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas, and two different cultures, Iroquoian and Algonquin, and was the site of many gatherings and intertribal ceremonies. To begin with the Mississauga of the New Credit First Nations, whose land we are on today, those of us who are settlers in Canada have directly benefited from the colonization and genocide of the Indigenous people of this land. To engage in resistance and solidarity against the injustices inflicted on the Indigenous people of this land, it is imperative we constantly work to engage in its acts of decolonization. This gesture of respect and acknowledgement in and itself does not remedy the many injustices of colonization. It's a small step in bringing, a very small step, in bringing awareness to where we are and how those of us who are non-Indigenous got here as settler colonizers. This also today is the International Day of Remembrance for people who use drugs. This is a pretty who back in the 60s, drug users started organizing themselves and into collectives and organizations to fight for their own rights, to take care of themselves based on mutual aid. They would pool their money and buy drugs to give to each other so no one would go without. These were acts of anarchism, which we're going to be talking about today. But the drug war has taken the lives of really vulnerable and racialized people, locked people. It's cost, the lives of so many people that lots of us love. And so drug users acknowledge this day every year. And part of it is so that we can remember and so that we can end the war on drugs, because drug users organize to change the way we talk about the drug war, the way we talk about drug users, and fighting stigma and discrimination every day. So, thanks.
Thank you, Zoe. I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of our event for today. But before I do that, I hope all of you have gotten one of our booklets that we've been handing out. If not, there's some at the back. That's an overview of the article that we worked on. We wrote this article while doing a writing retreat at Gibraltar Point on Toronto Island that was funded by the Institute for Anarchist Studies. So a shout out goes out to both of those groups for supporting our work. We also have a few pieces of merch that we're just going to try to pop to all of y'all. One of them is this beautiful Whatever AIDS Ribbon t-shirt. W is Whatever AIDS Ribbon. And this is a quote from our article that we'll be reading later, which says, actually I'll read it now, which says, well, in ways that view people's lives as a source of capital and where illness and disease are a revenue stream. So these are $20. There's only a few of them, but if you want them, please grab them or let us know. So Zoe and I are going to give an overview of some of the work we've written. Some of it is excerpts from the piece that we handed out, and other stuff we've been working on. We're going to talk for about 30 minutes, and then we really wanted to, and we're here until 9 p.m., or we have the space until 9 p.m. So the discussion will go from when we're finished talking to when you guys are finished talking with us. And there is a washroom, which is right over there, if people need to do that. And I'm going to pass it on to Zoe to get us started. Oh, last thing, we are being live streamed, so there is a camera pointing at us. During the discussion phase, okay. So just so people are aware, there is a live stream of us, but the room isn't being live streamed, but your questions might be heard by the live stream, just to hear.
So hi, live stream people. So yeah, thank you for coming. So this is actually the first time that we presented the work together live together. And have been kind of working on this for 3 years in discussions, but longer since we went to I think it actually started at the AIDS conference in Vienna, where we destroyed the Canadian booth, got kicked out. We're angry at the amount of money that is spent on an AIDS conference when like millions of people still don't have access to medication, and we just like reorganize ourselves and look for new ways of giving people what know what those solutions are. So yeah, so this came out of a lot of our frustration talking over the years. So we're excited to share a dialogue and like hopefully get more discussion going, because we do hold possibilities. So together we have decades of video in HIV as radicals, anarchists, activists, researchers, and frontline workers. Born out of our frustration, optimism, and a desire to change things, our goal is to examine ways of thinking while intentionally engaged with an anarchist worldview, to see how those most impacted by hepatitis C and HIV, as well as other conditions, could merge these ideas to put the actualization of health into their own hands. We are working on an ongoing writing project. This writing project has been developed collaboratively through a series of discussions with a wide range of radicals, anarchists, and people living with hepatitis C and or HIV in Canada. So if you've been part of those discussions, thank you, because some of you haven't. We hope through our writing and through ongoing dialogue and discussions to suggest an anarchist practice when analyzing current responses to HIV and hepatitis C. Specifically, we aim to examine the capitalist organization of healthcare, reactive forms of community-based politics, and interventions focused on homogenization and hierarchical intervention. Top-down this capitalist organization of healthcare and the reactive position activists have been forced into has created a context in which the imaginations of many people involved in the responses to HIV and hepatitis C have been limited to what is prescribed by funding bodies through disciplinary forms of knowledge or what is able to be marketized. Our work aims to stretch the imaginations of HIV and hepatitis C responses in place to save lives and bring an end. But instead, society is organized in a way that allows millions of people to continue to die. Our hope is that we can inspire people or create space where we can rethink how by the current systems to respond to HIV and hepatitis C are organized the way they are. With this, we aim to reconsider models of collective organizing to address these diseases. We also want to take a minute to dedicate our ongoing work to those who live with hepatitis and those who have died as a result of purposeful state neglect, profit-driven corporations, austerity, bureaucratic red tape, war, ongoing colonization, white supremacy, institutional violence, phobia. We have chosen to focus this work and our ongoing because of our work and personal connections to these epidemics. In addition, HIV and hepatitis C share unique elements. Both are highly impact marginalized and state-neglected communities, and both have emerged under neoliberalism. This is what we're talking about today, and we understand that our very engagement with anarchism are just totally out of left field, and that's okay. There was once an almost anarchist takeover of Toronto's AIDS Action Now, and there have been many smaller activist initiatives over the years. In our discussion, we will use some anarchist ideas to specifically challenge HIV and Hep C interventions focused on homogenization and hierarchical interventionists. These projects of standardization are designed to displace local organization. They often mobilize synoptic forms of surveillance that are aimed to help homogeneity as to make things rational for a higher authority. We'll examine what we mean by this more as we go. But we can see examples of these processes in settler colonization, the entire land ownership, urban planning, education, universal laws, and public health projects such as with HIV and Hep C seek and treat regimes.
As a distinct form of capitalist programs on individualism, entrepreneurship, and a reduction of the state, privatization, corporate and managerial rationality, and efficiency through cooperation. The managerial logic of neoliberalism has come to organize a capitalist system of healthcare that is deeply intertwined with for-profit transnational corporations, in which illness is now profitable, which we are allowed to respond to HIV and hepatitis C are prescribed by top-down, bureaucratized institutions of making or biomedical advances, billions of dollars invested in biomedical research, the development of thousands of non-governmental organizations, specific agencies, public-private partnerships, billion-dollar cause marketing campaigns, and multiple multi-million-dollar touring conferences to address the diseases. The corporate sector, the global HIV and hepatitis response can now limit conceptualizations of what is possible, including framing how knowledge and meaning are produced, where often positivist, measurable, quantifiable, and expert forms of knowledge are privileged to provide a professional image of efficient and strategic within capitalism. For example, forms of social science research developed on HIV and hepatitis C often reveal what people already know on the ground, but instead, the results come to produce a kind of expert knowledge that, as a commodity, can be used by authorities to justify forms of hierarchical decision-making that lose sight of people's housing for people living with HIV and hepatitis C in a North American context. There is even an annual touring housing HIV-focused conference. At this event, various professionals prevent rehousing for active drug users, housing that is linked to care and also managed in close contact with the police as a method to reduce HIV infections. Here, a basic need, such as housing, becomes understood as a form of control that is used instrumentally to support public health goals. In this context, resources are diverted to expertized forms of knowledge with the never-ending imperative for evidence when all that is actually needed is affordable housing. While there was no cure for HIV since the mid-90s, a range of drugs have been developed which can effectively block the virus from replicating and therefore keep the HIV suppressed in the body. This results in people being able to live with the virus for the full extent of their natural lives while no longer being infectious to others. Taken in combination, these drugs have been massively effective at saving people's lives, but only for those who have access. Access to these medications is privileges pharmaceutical company patents and results in further exacerbating existing wealth disparities around the world. People continue to die regularly due to lack of access to medications that are still out of reach to nearly 15 million people who need them. For hepatitis C, new treatments show cure rates of 90 to 100% with limited side effects. Gilead Pharmaceuticals stands to earn $30 billion American by 2020 for their new hepatitis C treatment. The drug currently costs 1,000 USD per pill, a course of treatment costing a total of 84,000 USD. Yet the actual cost of to manufacture this pill is estimated to be less than $250 American for the full course of treatment. This treatment and others now constitute a cure for HIV. Now has the ability to effectively cure hepatitis C. This drug is widely out of reach for most people due to the barrier and the capitalist profit imperative. Access to these treatments.
So what is anarchism? So anarchism is a theoretical and practical form of social organization between people without hierarchical forms of governance. Anarchism rests on a belief that people do not need coercive forces, prescriptive rules in place to ensure cooperation in society. To believe that we need coercive forces such as police, laws, bureaucrats, militaries, regimes, anarchists would argue is a limited and pessimistic understanding of the possibilities in people. Rather, anarchism is about mutual respect and do no harm. It employs the understanding that horizontal cooperation will bring relevant and responsive means to address social problems. With this, there is also a trust in spontaneity and a totalization in social learning. Thinking through an anarchist worldview requires that we question the drive to intervene. It calls on us to reflect on the power we hold when thinking through anarchist ways of doing things. Our current drive to endlessly plan, research, provide evidence, etc., we can easily get in the way. But generally, if people have questions of specific incidences, what would happen here, what will happen there, how would we organize, the answer would always be local and come from communities to question without hierarchy and without outside interference and without outsiders trying to make profit off bodies and illnesses. There are no specific prescribed answers, except that anarchism trusts that people will always innovate, and through cooperation, what we propose is a process-oriented or anarchism through the integration of theory and practice. What this means is that addressing social problems must come through a dialectical relationship between concerned groups of people over time. As both an activist and academic project, we want to be very clear that you do not need to be well-read and anarchist theory to view Europe as relevant. Rather, we would like to highlight that there are many anarchist principles in our communities. This is very true of responses to Hep C and HIV, where people's knowledge and life-saving medications, bodily autonomy, participation in decision-making, emancipation from forms of oppression, and the right to dignity and social justice for all people. Often those working in the Hep C and HIV responses are not aware that the goals I just stated are also exactly what anarchists strive to achieve. So very simply, many people in the HIV and Hep C response already enact anarchist theories without being aware that they are anarchists. So for our project, we wanted to examine what would be possible if we very consciously engaged with an anarchist worldview, to think through how people who are most impacted by Hep C and HIV, as well as other conditions, can start thinking about how to put the actualization of health into their own hands.
So to do this, we propose a number of tips and forms of bottom-up social organization that are tenets of an anarchist. These are mutual aid and collectivity, focusing on Your laugh always gets me. Okay, these are mutual aid and collectivity, and focusing on horizontal and local initiatives. I don't think we cover worker autonomy so much, but we cover the other two. In some cases, anarchy can be equated, or has been in the past, with violence and what anarchist forms of exploitation. A practical and grounded approach to anarchism ensures that we can be flexible, fluid, responsive, spontaneous, and resistant to the solely ideological. And by ideology, for the purposes of our project, we refer to Gary Kinsman, queer activist, past member of AIDS Action Now, who notes that forms of knowledge that attend to managing people's lives that are not grounded in actual experiences and practices. So we believe that theoretical forms of organization that are not grounded in people's lived realities have the potential to be dangerous, oppressive, and violent. In our work, we're not pursuing anarchism, and this is where anarchism differs from many other theories how to organize society or respond to larger scale crises. We are not about elaborating a form of prescriptive ideological or macro-theoretical forms of socialization. We generally resist the modernist project of proposing hyper-rational and universalizing forms of organization that are rooted in a false paradigm of linear progress. Such ideologies are often concerned with the administration of things through centralized top-down social planning. These systems often see one solution. Interventions that result from these initiatives can force a singular solution onto people in ways that can be disconnected from people's local knowledge of their daily lives. This singular view, which is interested in decentralization, heterogeneity, and respect for local knowledge and specificity, argue that in the context of HIV and Hep C, that epidemic management is only possible through a top-down system of surveillance, identification, containment, control. Centralized management and centralization of information has helped to understand the scope of the epidemic and who is most impacted, etc. We look back in history, people have been using the power of cooperation since of AIDS and hepatitis. Mutual aid is about the realization that human social and that individual and self-action and connection. In the early days of the HIV epidemic, in a context of massive and systemic neglect, people impacted and affected by HIV care and communities, helping people die with dignity in non-stigmatizing environments, pooling medications and distributing them to one another outside of official systems of access, establishing collective community clinics, and developing community prevention and breaking laws that barred access, hosting supervised consumption sites without official approval. Or today, when we refuse to document details about people in public health databases for fears of how data collection systems will fund or change funding stats to satisfy funding requirements. These are all forms of anarchism.
Just 10 years ago, there were still a number of AIDS service organizations organized non-hierarchical models formed around feminist principles of collectivity. These organizations were forced to change their structures to conform to funder standards. And while we are constantly forced to monitor, evaluate, and provide evidence about why and how we do what we do, the massive change in how we organize and deliver interventions has not been examined in any way to see if having middle managers responding to HIV and Hep C more effective for those on the ground. Another example is from one of the early Truvada treatment as prevention trials conducted on sex workers in Nigeria in the early 2000s, where in a context with limited to no treatment access, it was rational for women in the trial to keep all the meds for themselves if they tested positive at a later date, or distribute them to family members who needed them for survival instead of prevention. The trial was discontinued as a result and deemed a failure by Gilead in USA. But the women did what they needed to do for themselves and their community. Examples like this in the HIV and Hep C responses. Another inspirational is the prohibitively expensive exclusionary access to hepatitis C medication. In many places around the world, people are unable to access government-funded Hep C treatment, have come together on online chat forums. There's one called Treatment Without Borders. And using social media to advise one another on how to legally access affordable medications directly from generic drug manufacturers. There's actually a blog by a man named Greg Jeffries who has written what all the legalities are of if you can bring meds into the country, you can actually get them shipped to you. So people living with Hep C, instead of $85,000 for a course of treatment have been able to get Hep C treatment for $1,000 from generics manufactured in India, and people have been helping each other do that, giving advice to each other online, and talking about like side effects or how they got them, how it went, what manufacturer they got them from. It's pretty inspirational. I think and you hear people like that doing that, and it's like massively inspiring. So traveling to governments have negotiated for cheaper drugs. In the spirit of HIV buyers clubs, virtual groups of so-called non-professionals are providing health support to one another and are subverting oppressive state and corporate systems to get what they need. A course of treatment that costs $94,000 can then be accessed for $1,000. We see that as central to mobilizing forces of anarchism for healthcare. The active realization of the anarchist principles of mutual aid. People take what they need and support each other regardless of what a higher authority deems as appropriate. It's often totally out of touch with the lived realities on the ground. As example lives to think that breaking rules and undermining systems of authority is wrong. But as anarchist and linguist Noam Chomsky states, authority, unless justified, is inherently illegitimate, and that the burden of proof is on those in authority. If this burden can't be met, the authority in question should be dismantled.
So let's chat a little bit about the notion of homogenization.
Say it just the same way.
Homogenization. If we like colonization as a project of homogenization, we can see that nation state has systematically worked to brutally and violently erase local and customary practices and ways of life. Diverse languages have been replaced by common national language, local laws and customary practices in the legal system, local land use practices and regional understanding of land ownership were taken away and replaced by a common for easier land transfer and taxation, and local practices and knowledge of heat were replaced by national or provincial healthcare systems and forms of top-down expertise. Local practices of sharing knowledge and teaching were replaced by a national and provincial schooling system. As we know, this is what happened in Canada in the Canadian nation-building context, where through the systematic genocide of Indigenous people and diverse local ways of life, settler colonizers aim to homogenize the population and either totally erase or bring under heightened governance deviations so as to strengthen the rational organization of the liberal nation state, thus opening up wider markets for the dispersion of capital and producing a moral and respectable population which was understood to help enable and develop a strong new white nation state. In this violent project of sameness, people who didn't fit into mainstream categorizations were considered deviant and thus needed to be classified, regulated, normalized, controlled, surveilled, or destroyed. This is a project of this project of homogenization is also a key aspect to hepatitis C and HIV responses, as homogenization has been a major component of the grand modernist project of science itself, where since the Enlightenment has understood the human body can be made knowable, classifiable, and rational through the work of highly trained experts developing specialized forms of knowledge. In HIV and hepatitis C, interventions must always be scaled up, official, systematized, credentialized, regulated, and organized. For example, as governed by the United Nations, the country is supposed to have a top-down strategy to frame how to respond, how the HIV response is organized, to prescribe programs of action onto diverse local communities, often without addressing or initiating hierarchical systems of representation and participation, such as with what are called Global Fund on HIV, TB, and Malaria, which privilege the participation of representatives who speak the language and who follow the rules of the higher authority. In many instances, local cultures, vernacular practices, and community barriers, or as in opposition to official and effective and rational hepatitis C and HIV responses. And those practices must be intervened into and changed to make people's practices acceptable to universal norms. In our work to respond to the diseases, people living with HIV are identified, monitored, surveilled by higher authorities, and are coerced into being neutralized via anti-HIV. And if they aren't coerced into that, then they are incarcerated or quarantined in prisons. The effect of these pills on our bodies.
One of the biggest current trends in the HIV responses are massively funded countrywide seek and treat interventions, and we can thank the BC Center for Excellence for their excellence. I actually got banned from their Facebook research project where they were giving researchers a ton of money to research how people spend. And I was like, you know what? I can tell you in 20 minutes. Increase people's money, first of all, and second of all, you try living on welfare. So it pissed me off. I looked at one of them and they were sitting on a yacht. On their Facebook page, I trolled them. and then I got blocked. The BC of Excellence on HIV/AIDS did this program in British Columbia, Canada, in partnership with medical establishment, government, through mainly injection drug use. Who struggle living in poverty, many without housing in Vancouver's downtown east side, and immediately put those who are HIV positive on treatment so as to prevent future onward transmissions. This approach we know is called treatment as prevention, and it's driven by a form of hypervalorization of expert paternalism and celebrity doctor hero worship, adoptable communities, organizations, now entire countries from an entire local plane of reason and science. As this new norm of intervention, people with HIV are put on treatment to reduce their viral load and thus make them less infectious to others. In the seek and treat model, HIV testing in public parks, financial incentive to get tested. Overall, this intervention must be tested and treated with medicines to protect the general public rather than as people who should be able to make autonomous individual choices about their. Since going on anti-HIV drugs is a lifelong commitment, and some people do not need to go on these pills right away. Also, one cannot forget the long-term impacts and side effects of being on these pills. In these processes, the agency and autonomy of people living understood as mere instruments in the HIV response to further HIV prevention aims. As a top-down social planning initiative, this is to address the lived realities of people who live in poverty. So to wrap up, we do not believe that there is one solution to social problems such as Hep C and HIV, but rather, as Malatesta says, 1,000 in the same way as social existence is different and varied in time and space. As conditions change for people, so must the mechanisms to address how society will function and respond. Through ongoing dialogue, reflection, and critical engagement without hierarchy or top-down decision-making, an anarchist approach aims to ensure people's needs are met directly and resources to address them are made available to everyone.
Activism on Hep C and HIV is often focused on defensive and negative impacts of governments and state institutions, such as highlighting human rights abuses, bureaucratic barriers to HIV access and care, and marginalized drug users, sex workers, and people living with HIV and or hepatitis C. Around hepatitis C and HIV revolves around making claims on the state, including claims for human rights, claims for funding, and entitlement for forms of citizenship. This results in activists and community groups spending an enormous amount of time working to address state administrative and institutional bureaucratic and legal barriers imposed by higher authorities. In this context, social scientists, I'm one of them, clamor to develop projects aiming to document or reveal the latest ways in which key populations are being marginalized, barred access to rights, and evidence to help enable change. In this context, the newest disastrous conservative policy or intervention becomes the research topic for social scientists to dissect, consume, critique, and produce knowledge on. Often social research developed on HIV and hepatitis C is based on what people already know on the ground, with the results producing an expert form of knowledge that is redundant to what people already know and who are working and seeing for many years. As a quick side note, we do not need more research projects telling us that housing will be actual housing. But to to the valorization of expert forms of knowledge, expert knowledge helps support and justify forms of hierarchical decision continues.
So we hope we can all take a step back and imagine for a minute what our response to HIV and Hep C could look like if we have to constantly battle, if you work in HIV and Hep C, like I do, drugs. The war on drugs, harm reduction, treatment access, criminalization, health inequality, these are all issues related to hierarchical decision making and liberal nation state and the capitalist organization of society. Now imagine what we could get done if we didn't have these systems in place. If people were authority. For those of us in public health, healthcare, and service delivery, I hope we can think about how much of your work is focused on behavior modification, subtle or benevolent seeming, focused on trying to intervene, aimed at trying to coerce other people to do what you think is right, or the system of knowledge you work with thinks is right, and why we may feel justified in doing this type of work, or what the consequence of this way of working does to our social relations. And for those of us who are social scientists, I hope we're here to be applied technicians to support the endless imperative for expert evidence, or are we here to help integrate and provide deep philosophical reflection on how and why certain regimes of truth have come to render organization possible, while others are rendered impossible, too optimistic. So lastly, what would be possible if our society was not organized in ways that views people's bodies as a source of capital, and where illness and disease are a revenue stream, institutions, and a range of... Thank you.
We're so bad at it, we stuck to the 30 minutes. So those questions were for you guys. Do you think you can answer them?
Yeah, so we're going to do like a question and answer, a discussion of questions, you know, like, I know you can go. You can also ask questions, but like in my work, I work in Hep C. I've been working in Hep C for 12 years. I helped like to create a program for people who actively use drugs to get Hep C treatment because people were actively and systemically denied access to treatment to medication. There was never any scientific evidence to back up people who use drugs who are living with Hep C should be not included in access to Hep C treatment. Never any science to back it up. But 80% of specialists in Canada still refuse to treat some drugs, but not be systematically denied access to treatment that could save their lives, but they are. And today I went to the funeral of someone who died of liver failure who was taken off of a transplant list because she was a non-compliant patient. That doctor wrote one line of a letter. He was able to make the determination of whether a 44-year-old woman with friends and community would live or die for substance use. So these kinds of acts are happening all the time. But the problem with Hep C is that Hep C has always been a thing of exclusion. It has always been about excluding someone because the costs of the drugs are so fucking high. So their new drug just came out, Gilead's So Kind. It's not $1,000 a pill a day, it's $785 a pill a day. And so people ask me all the time, what kind of system could we have? Well, government and drug companies are both totally blamed for the fact that the drugs are so high. We shouldn't have pharmaceutical companies creating the drugs. Those should be institutions that belong to and the drugs that are manufactured should be manufactured in a way that we care about people first. And so these institutions should then, these organizations, medication should be shared. It should be shared universally so that 15 million people living with HIV are not going out without meds. And it's not the meds we dump in their countries because but you can have this shitty med. And so when we're thinking about this, we need to start thinking about aspirations. And I think about those. I'm like, you could have this organized, you could have these in each different country with people who have that knowledge creating those, and that would be belonging to us, and that would be access to everyone, and there wouldn't be no profit imperative in it because about people's survival, it would be keeping people alive. When we had a cure for a virus where we could totally eradicate it, but that is not how our system is anymore. Our system isn't about looking at like eradication of virus. It's about making as much profit as possible. So as we enter into discussion or questions, like that's my example, and then we could have that here, and then other people could share that knowledge. We could create those bodies, and they would be controlled by us. So that's my example. Anyway, hopefully, yes.
So this is more just kind of going, because you mentioned that, because I come from the sciences, and this is sort of what analytics science, what would the research in terms of like looking at cells, looking at like petri dishes, doing research, like what does that look like in an analytics context? And that's something I've been picking a lot up lately. So basically thinking that excited to pick up.
I have a question.
Okay. What I'm going to do is repeat the question for the live streams, and if I butcher it, please intervene. But I think the question was, as a scientist, how do we do the actual practical work in a lab of being a scientist if you are an anarchist in your daily life? Yeah.
Not so much.
No?
So like I'm not questioning that it can be done. I'm just wondering how it would look.
How it would look. Okay. Do people in the audience have?
And like, is that something that sort of be the basis of
So the question was, in our research on our work, have we found previous examples of people working on diseases or working in healthcare in an anarchist context?
So I think like looking at Dr. Bunting, and insulin was actually created in a way that too, that he didn't want to make a huge profit off of it. And so, and I think that's really cool that like a scientist like that was like, you know, and if he wanted to make a huge profit in the patenting and property laws that we have today, insulin could be way more expensive than it is. Not to say that those prices don't increase. So like you look at a drug like naloxone. So naloxone helps to reverse, since we've been like talking about naloxone, trying to get naloxone access to people who use drugs, the price of naloxone has skyrocketed because we can't control that. So something that costs like a few cents is now dollars and dollar price. And so I think that when we think about these things, I think we do need to dream big. So what could scientists do? Do they get to like work in a lab that is controlled publicly, do work or self-manage, and then they can work on things so that you're really interested about the cure for hepatitis C, a place with other scientists actually working on that, where no one has patented the hep C virus and owns that, that owns the patent of the hep C virus and the HIV virus. So, you know, that in itself creates barriers to actually working on some of these things. So, you know, I think we do need to stretch our imaginations of how we just have to switch our minds. So I think could hold the solutions of how that could work. When you're at your job, like I think about that at my job, I think, oh, I would keep this. This is really cool. We have like people living with hep C who are engaged here, working here, doing all of this work. This could be completely work or self-managed. We wouldn't do any of this kind of reporting and data collection because we wouldn't have to. And we would like shift and change because some of those institutions, they already exist. Some of these really good ideas already exist in the world. And how do we make them so that they actually are about people and not like funding bodies and the hierarchy of it and reorganizing ourselves and shift? I don't know if that answers your question because I don't really have an answer, but I think we have answers within ourselves and with other people you're working with, and we should be dialoguing about what those, like, dream what that would look like without an ED, dream what that would look like without like Gilead or Merck or Novartis or all the other huge pharmaceutical companies, or people who really wanted to like create awesome and not seeing those things like material highs.
And just responding to whether there was an example,
Yeah.
you mentioned getting hep C drugs for $1,000 from India.
Yeah.
So India is an example.
Yeah, India's a great
right?
example.
Where I haven't followed it recently, but it's been a history of pushing back against pharmaceuticals and reverse technologizing essentially medication and refusing, right, to be held and being like faced by you know, really pushing back against it. So I don't know where it is now. I haven't paid attention in a while, but I know that was a major fight for a long time, and that was a state's fight, right?
Yeah, and that exists. So in Hep C treatment, it's been really fascinating. You can kind of, there's like some stuff that's happened with a minister and Gilead and the U.S. intervention and trying to get them to stop manufacturing. The thing that starts to happen when, people are taking it upon themselves, they're entering the country, they're bringing back generics, the drug companies start to try to figure out ways to make it harder and go after countries. And you can see that even in the example of Thailand and HIV meds and Abbott, and I don't know if you want to speak more to that, what happened there.
Well, that was in like 2007. But yeah, it's a historical example that we will hopefully will include in our longer work, but you can look it up in that Thailand evoked parts of the Doha Declaration to enable access to life-saving medications to break patents. So they brought in the Indian generic drugs and then received like a huge consequence from Abbott, who withdrew all their other drugs from the Thai market. Which had like great life-saving consequences for people, and there was a massive campaign to address it, but that's just what Abbott did.
Do you want to use the mic? Then everyone can hear you.
I think there was another act of resistance. I think it was Indonesia, but I was going to suggest that in terms of pharmaceutical companies would be to challenge international intellectual property law. Instead, it has the basis of the solution, providing the data, the raw data, that the medications are developed from, sort of give that up freely. And I think the case in Indonesia was they're like, you use the raw virus, I think it might have been TB or something, and they developed the back to us at an astronomical price. So they were like, my doctor told me that HIV did mutate, and there's one strain that is resistant to current drugs, and that person was in Toronto, and if we withhold that's in our bodies, they can't make picking up that. And maybe they can't in turn profit from what we're giving out freely. And that would mean not participating in drug trials for free, don't take the sort of low-hanging fruit. But
Yeah, that makes sense. There's a resistance to engage in those processes. Because it's on hepatitis C, and Gilead actively owns all of the biological molecules that comprise HIV separately, but they essentially own hepatitis C as the virus, the consequences of that. But
Is it okay if I ask
Yeah,
you
go
one?
for it.
Cool. No, so just you got me thinking, and I was kind of wondering this as we were talking, is patient data collection inherently about surveillance and is it inherently obsessive? Or is it a lot also where you can obviously ask clinician, compensate patients for the data, like that kind of thing, because he's willing to governments to keep track of who it is as opposed to people doing research. But if they're trying to decolonize research, how does the information collection?
do you want to give an example from your work?
I hope it's not too much.
You could just talk about what you're asked to do in your work.
Yeah, so I actually think that people think more about what's in their medical charts, what's being shared, who owns the data, where the data is stored. And I work in the community health. One of the companies that that does data, that collects our data, Nightingale, just got sold. So to me, I'm like, who owns that? Who owns that information? Where is that information stored? Who gets access to that information? Do I think we should be worried? Yeah, I do. We should be worried because we live in a hyper-surveillance culture, and I think that we're kidding ourselves if our information doesn't get shared in certain ways. And for a lot of people, that information can be detrimental to their health. It can be a different doctor's office, or you go to a different social worker, and you have no clue that they know all of this information about you that you never told them. But because the systems are more and more shared, they have more access to your information. You should be allowed to tell people what you like with each visit. You should be allowed to, okay, I'll just out myself, but when I go to my doctor, there is certain information I'm willing to give them because I've been totally discriminated against as somebody with a drug using history to the point where it's almost cost me. It cost me. It was a horrible incident that happened to me at Women's College Hospital because they thought I was drug seeking. That information got shared with them, gets shared with my doctor. I go for an eye appointment. The eye specialist asks me if I'm injecting drugs. I ask what that has to do with my eye. You know, it just continues, and that information just gets continued. So on an individual level, the massive discrimination that you can face in the healthcare system with people who didn't want to have your information shared, but then on a surveillance level, yeah, we should be worried. So in England, the Secret Service there got access backdoor to people's health records, media that this happened. What are they looking for? What kind of, you know, I'm always worried about containment, surveillance. You can't trust the state. Like, we're kidding ourselves if we can trust what they're doing with their information. So yeah, I think we would, personally, I think we would try to do away with some of those.
And if you're a person who lives with one of these two diseases who is then criminalized by the state, your healthcare records are then subpoenaed or just handed over to the police and crown prosecutors and then used in courts. Sometimes people's own nurses and doctors will testify against them. And so, because they think they're supposed to, or it's their moral imperative because their client is a criminal. So when data is centralized in that way, it has all these other consequences for people, especially people living with HIV and hepatitis C or very heavily criminalized populations. I actively advocate for people to ask all healthcare providers how information is used and why, and then not provide as much information as possible. Like, just don't provide information. If you're going for anonymous testing, tell all people, or tell them if they ask for contacts that everyone you sleep with, you don't know that you only have anonymous sex, for example. So they can't do contact tracing. Strategies you can use. Or just don't discuss anything about your life around who you disclose your HIV status, which means that that could have a consequence on your level of access to care, which is not ideal and could be detrimental to people's health. But it could also keep people out of jail, which is also very detrimental to people's health. So.
And I would say that healthcare providers often do not think about data collection. They are not thinking about who owns the data. Nobody was asking who owns this information, who has that information. How much further are we going to go in a needle exchange asking people personal things? Why are we asking these things? It's shit should be not. And you know, if you are a worker collecting as much data as you are and put as minimal, you should see the shit that I have not data collected because I refuse to do it. I think that I don't want to participate in that, and that is a form of resistance.
Could I just respond around anonymous HIV testing? So HALCO, the HIV Legal Clinic of Ontario, recently announced a new kind of measure in Ontario. I'm not sure if it's national, but it's definitely in Ontario that you can, if you receive a reactive result for an anonymous HIV test, or like it's a positive test result, you're HIV positive, that is often where folks would end up having their health card, their name linked to that HIV diagnosis. Possible for you to request of your doctor or nurse attending to you to do an anonymous test, and it's a possibility now that's like permissible through the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care. So you're able to access care, which essentially is monitoring your viral load, so the amount of virus that's in your system. So you want to access nominal care or have your name and your OHIP number, your health card, linked to an HIV diagnosis. But in the interim, you could wait an anonymous viral load test and monitor your virus to see if you are at a stage where you need to access medication and engage in that state surveillance of your use.
It's very good news because it's counter to what's happening. Viral load is becoming increasingly mandatorily reportable. And in Tennessee, for example, your viral leads, maybe you haven't been taking your medication. Nurses will call you if you do not answer them. The second protocol after you not answering when they call you is to come to the police officer and force you to take medication. So people in Canada are worried that that's going to happen here, but it sounds like in Ontario there's some maybe progressive changes.
I was just wondering, it's been taken, like when you see other cases like Cindy Blackburn took on the child welfare system, and just taking one case, I mean, she worked for it for like 20 years. In order to change things, the systems change are very, very slow. But hearing you guys talk, I feel like it would be taking someone like would die from not having access to treatment, or like unfortunately take it to that level, because I too, I work in the front line, and we're often just like covering emergencies and, you know, just on the ground. So I'm just wondering if you like collectively know.
I mean, I think we talked about this in Hep C, because I am like working with someone right now who, after 15 years of going to Mount Sinai, was turned away repeatedly for Hep C treatment because they kept testing them for drug use. And within the time they came to us in the program I work in, they already had cirrhosis. The cirrhosis, we tried treatment, it didn't work. Then they've been waiting for all these new medications to come out, which take them forever long, because they have to go through these drug reviews, and each province negotiates their own pricing, which is just like horrifically slow. And in that time, we thought we'd get him into a trial. He's got liver cancer, and he's dying. His days left abundant. There is so many of them. And as a frontline worker, I'm just witness to this drowning in death. And I have been, you know, I work at a health center that has a memorial. We put 8 names on that memorial. Out of 10 of them were in the Hep C program I work in. People are dying, and we spend a lot of time like trying to fight these systems and to like make space and get breadcrumbs, take on these legal actions that take so long. And for me, I feel like some days I feel like this desperation of like, this shit needs to change. Like, how many more lawyers do we get involved? How many legal actions, how many laws do we try to change? We have it in ourselves to start pushing and demand nothing. And I think if people want to enter into class action suit, I can think of a number. I think that they should sue who still practice, who totally have caused harm and death in people's lives. And but I do think we have to get to a point in response to Hep C and HIV where we reorganize ourselves and we start making changes and thinking about how we change the system, because we're organizing ourselves within it. So I guess we have this theory that we talk about a lot, which is like working within, against, and beyond. So it doesn't really answer your question, but I am like constantly thinking about like, fuck this, like what can we do? How can we change this? How do we stop? How do I as like feel that my workplace and other workplaces are entrenched in?
Well, it was like the Blackbird working my agency. I'm taking on system.
Yeah.
And I think that's really inspirational. And like to take on the child welfare system because they weren't giving like to Indigenous children.
Yeah.
And she's still not happy because they're still not getting it. But I think that somewhere, I think collective, like as it shows that one person, and obviously she had people working with her, can do something. We need to start somewhere. The work that will continue.
Yeah.
And I think that I mean.
I think those fights are important. Cindy Blackburn is an inspirational person, and I think that there are people like that who've like really made some really huge advances in things for people, and I think that's important because when we think about system changing, that helps us to like really change the system. So it's like making the paths for people. She's amazing. That is a drive. It is a drive.
I had a question about sort of the responses to those medication sharing across borders and stuff like that. Like, what were the like official responses by like pharmaceutical companies, governments, and other authorities? But then with this conversation around patients, other people, and like the idea of like or people who are getting tested not giving information for years, and I do remember a period where I wanted to make changes in the I wanted to stop taking medication because I thought that was like what I action to where I was at that point. And there was a chilling between myself and my primary care providers.
And I'm just wondering, it was difficult enough going through that, but I'm just wondering, there seems to be so many punitive measures on like both the individual larger, like more against collective actions. And maybe my question is, how can we form a response that's resilient to these chills and these punitive measures, and how we engage in resistance when you feel like it's just really scary?
I don't know if I have an answer for that. I don't know reaction to that.
I can tell you about the Hep C treatment stuff because my friend has helped start Hep C Treatment Without Borders and have like a Facebook group. And what was interesting was how Gilead used, they pretended like they were just like regular people. So they have like they're just like fake people, but they're Gilead employees, spies. And they like went on that group and they tried to infiltrate it and they tried to like give misinformation and all this stuff. And then they noticed some of us on the No Treatment Without Borders, and they noticed we were all this like Hep C family and friends group. And one day we found a group of us group, and we were like, oh, very interesting. And they also have like their drug people within that as well, giving information. And I think that I think they do these things that are kind of like, they seem like maybe that's not a big deal, but it really is actually, because they were trying to like misinform and scare people, like, oh, if you take the generics, you're just gonna like fuck yourself up, and the generics aren't as good. What's happening in India right now, where they're like fighting over the patenting and the patenting laws around the generics for Hep C treatment, and I think they're super upset that people are going to India to get the medications that work, generics work. And it's interesting because like in a lot of countries, like, it's good that they have access to generics. Like here in Canada, it's 8 years before the patent is up, so that wouldn't even happen. The new treatments would be so obsolete by the time that comes around. But to answer your question about like resistance and resilience, I think that this is like a larger conversation that we should all be having. I think people do different things. Like at my work, people will say, I want all of my stuff in a lockbox. I want it in this like my medical information all locked up. I don't want it shared. And then I think like informing people about how your information, I think people who are workers really need to like have knowledge about how people's information truly gets shared. Like a client of mine told his patient with a lawyer, and I called him up and was like, you realize when you say all of your information, it means all the social work notes, like every single person you've seen in the health center, like that's when you say all your information. And they didn't understand that, and so I think there needs to be more clarity around that, and people who are working have that role to play resistance, and also other people who access health services should be sharing their knowledge with each other. So, I don't know, that's like everyday resistance, I guess.
I think it's like,
You can tell it.
I think a friend of mine talked about like transactional self-defense, and he
Yeah.
would, and this is one of the, so I also like work at a community health center, and it's one of the things that is really trying to ensure that whenever I work with someone, that they know the limitations of what I can do before things have to be reported, or before I need to just form a consent process as literally and as broadly as you can, and just be really explicit about like, and these are the ways that we can get around those things, and these are the things that I need to, these are like the things, and these are things that are going to bite you in the ass, so don't do them.
In relation to the criminalization of HIV, and this is kind of just a shameless plug, but a group of us in Montreal wrote a document called How to Have Sex in a Police State, which is driven by people living with HIV, sharing their own personal stories of how to resist systems of surveillance, police or public health or otherwise, or community-based, and people can do to protect themselves from being criminalized or surveilled or having their data collected by community-based organizations. And interesting, in terms of resistance, here in itself kind of fell flat in terms of the HIV response in Canada. It wasn't really well, negative reactions, and we're told actually by Positive Light, the main news source, that they refused to write about it because it was too controversial that we would ask people to not participate in public health systems. But it ended up trickling to the United Nations, and the head of UNAIDS, who works on HIV criminalization, read and emailed us and said it's the best thing she's ever read on HIV criminalization, and wrote about it in this report, which was cool in terms of getting recognition from an annoying higher authority. But it's still cool, because sometimes in context of trying to be an or actively resist these systems, people freak out or don't want you to talk about what you're doing. But you can look it up, How to Have Sex in a Police State. It's on a Tumblr site. Michael Erickson has a comment.
Yeah, I can probably project. So I guess I'm kind of thinking about what are your thoughts on too loud gas? What are your thoughts on, like, I hate to use like a term capacity, his capacity? You know, like how that's do you like, are there enough people? Are there more people? Are there less people? Like, how do we build enough folks who are involved in this practice to actually affect change? Because if that number is shrinking, which it kind of maybe feels like compared to the past, then aren't our like actual our labor resources shrinking and our abilities to respond shrinking? And I feel like one of the Anarchist dynamics of like direct action.
I think people want something different, but we haven't been like talking about it enough, about what that could look like, and what are those ideas, and you know, they really reached up into this like academic echelon that lots of people don't access. Like, I'm not an academic. I, you know, engage in these things, but like, I've never been to university, and so that's kind of where those kinds of ideas sit. And then there's this other part where it's just like on the ground, like fight the state, that kind of stuff. And so I don't think we have like had these like open discussions and dialogues to really think about aspirationally what could be different, what could we do, like what are we sharing with each other to think differently about the system we live in. We need to be sharing that with each other. And so I think when we think about capacity, it's like it's about us. It's about talking to each other. It's about dialoguing. You don't have to have the ideology of anarchism. It's just like, what world can we live in? How could things be better? And like opening. This is great. So many people came out, but there's interest in having discussions. Anarchism gets like such a stupid rap because, you know, we have this idea of what it is, and it isn't what it is. And you know, for me, anarchism is about like love and community and building and worker self-management and non-hierarchical forms of oppression. And I want us to have those dialogues. I want us to create that world. I think we could. We're just afraid. I think we have a lot of fear about what could be different. How could we do that? I think we're afraid. And I think we have it in ourselves to just do that with each other. We're in a system that displaces us on purpose, that isolates us from each other, that strips apart communities, that doesn't allow for that engagement. And I think that's the building blocks. That's what we need to do. We need to be conversing and dialoguing and inspiring each other and not being afraid to dream about a different world and how those
places, like somewhat collectively run community health center that potentially without a boss system could be a beautiful anarchist-run health center. And so just continually thinking in and against and beyond so that it doesn't, I mean, I think we can get caught up or overwhelmed by the possibility of, oh shit, we have to tear everything down and start from scratch. But I think that way of conceptualizing things makes it less scary. Thinking about what we're doing now in the moment, what we could be doing in the future, and what we totally don't want and want to say fuck off to.
You mentioned earlier about how organizations focused on Hep C and HIV have become more hierarchical due to funding. Could you give some examples of how that, like what that looks like?
I mean, I think the whole AIDS service organizations and yeah, I think we, like even if you look at the like the language that is being used in our organizations now, people are like knowledge brokers. We have CEOs. Like we are not like it's getting so far away from like on the ground community you work. Everyone is a coordinator. You coordinate referrals, but there's no direct service for women living in HIV. We don't have a women living in HIV organization anymore. And then we're expected to have boards of directors and executive directors and middle managers, and that's gonna like help with all of these issues. And then you've seen cuts to like workers, and everything's contract based now. And so I started an organization that was like 80 people, now it's 140 people. There's pressure from the Ontario government for organizations to eat up other organizations and to like become these larger organizations. And it's really changing the way that we work. It's changing it into like very top down instead of these things. Sometimes with decisions would be more flat. There would be more engagement with people with lived experience. And now we're professionalizing roles that were roles of experience. Now it's like you have to have a master's of social work for doing a drop-in job. You know, why do you need a master's of social work to work in a drop-in? You don't. So there's the professionalization of our organizations. They're becoming very neoliberal. Well, they are neoliberal. I mean, the social service sector has a whole other thing we can talk about for a long time. But yeah, they'll funding for a frontline position, but suddenly you have a new manager, so there's funding for managerial positions, and so we've seen ourselves reorganizing in the public health sectors, and things are not getting easier. Actually, you're doing more work, you're collecting more data, and you're seeing more people. So.
And a lot of the original HIV organizations were organized as collectives without specific bosses. And then in Ontario, and then the AIDS Bureau, through the Ontario Ministry of Health, basically forced them to hire bosses and get rid of their collective structure so that they were simpler to organize and manage. And then they instituted a board of directors way of working, because that's how any NGO should work under taxation law. So the original kind of activist and feminist organizing principles that guided those organizations were changed because of a top-down system of financial coercion in order to allow them to get funding from the state. And that happened over a long period of time for some, but it drastically shifted how they operated.
I used to work at an organization called Street Health, and Street Health was formed by like homeless people who had identified nurses as people they trusted and wanted to start an organization. When I started there, the board of directors was like half of the people on the board had to have experienced homelessness. A lot of people there were people on the board who were still homeless. And then as like things have shifted to funding bodies and the way that we're supposed to report, they started to get more like corporate people on the board. Like somehow a corporate person is going to know about homelessness. Like somehow they hold some sort of expert knowledge, but they're now the boss of the organization. And so that created like a lot of conflict in the organization, and when staff were having problems with just this one executive director whose boss is the board of directors, they got helped get rid of 25 of us got pushed out of the organization. We had to unionize, we had to like fight back against this like shitty boss who in the end got fired, but not after the whole organization lost what its identity was. They stopped being an advocate for homelessness. They got rid of all the homeless people off of their board of directors. And so you see those shifts in organizations, and you see a really conservative, like organizations that are very conservative and corporatized, and yeah, it sucks. Yeah.
Well, this is really optimistic because my organization hasn't had a director for over a year.
Yay.
But this is not like because we have the money.
Oh, okay.
But at the same time, I feel like it's kind of like good. Now I'm thinking, because in my head, working community, I'm like, we need a director because we're all like, we don't have any direction and it's chaos at work. But at the same time, maybe this is actually really good because we're able to take more political action, like for a lot of different things. So it's been very positive because now I'm more optimistic to go back to work. So thank you.
That's really cool. That's really cool. Because a lot of times people are told like you can't work collectively. That's really hard. Well, it's hard no matter what you're doing. Yeah. So I think it's worth trying and like holding each other accountable, and that's cool. I want to work somewhere where that's Sorry about this.
So we have time for a few more questions.
I was just wondering if you, maybe this is a bit nerdy, just because my dad was a computer programmer, but have you kind of looked at like open source, and I know like it's got problems too because now it's become like monetized and everything. But originally, like the idea was to like change a corporate computer system into like a freely shareable, like not in terms of money, but freely in terms of the information that was contained in the computer systems. Like, is that something that could be something optimistic?
Totally could.
Like, I don't
What
know.
do you think?
I just think like if people like maybe to share, especially when I was really inspired when you were talking about like, you know, because I think the big thing that I thought about was like how do you create these medications if you don't have like the capital, the resources or whatever to like, you know, fund people to like spend the time working on creating the medications, but maybe open source is like the way.
I think we need to get rid of patenting property laws from the pharmaceutical industry. Like the patenting and property laws and the massive trade agreements are like such a huge barrier. But yeah, I think using like the internet and open source and all those things with like that kind of access to information has been like highly, it's been really good in lots of ways.
I'm not part of the health sector or work in HIV, but I have, of course, my heart goes to people that I love and would live with it. What I can share experience, I work on energy access in developing countries, the remotest regions, under-resourced environments, and what's been very helpful for us is to not stick to the bubble of the energy experts, because most of the solutions that come from self-organized groups, ways to increase resilience of these local systems. We reach out to people working in other sectors, and that's helped us quite a lot. People working on agriculture, access to water, all kinds of different topics. It's uncomfortable to go out of your expert field. It's often a reason to have a fight with someone else who doesn't speak your language. But it's definitely helped us add value to what we do. And I think that builds resilience. When it comes to also transferring knowledge and solutions from one place to the other, we don't really look to the West and fancy universities where things usually would come from or what you hear about. We do South-South collaborations, and this is incredible. And I think for some of the solutions, at least in Europe, and European, happened to be here for a few months, we also in Europe, for some of the social services, we look at solutions that come from the South, because if you're working in an environment that's over-corporatized, overly state-driven, you see the bias and the bottlenecks there. In most of the resilient solutions come from under-resourced environments, and I think the left in Europe is learning from these experiences, some of the African and Southeast Asian countries, and that's really, really useful for some of the discussions that we're having. A concern that I have is how you stay ahead of the game, because for us, we see big corporate state models being transported into the energy sector. Things are being imposed on us as a potential solution, or homogenization of solutions that exist in one geography being transported to another one. What we try, and the communities we work with try to do, is stay ahead of the game, being better informed, and organize your knowledge that you're better at finding solution for your own problem than someone who could bring you the solution to you. And for the HIV space, in Europe we've had this discussion a lot with people in the labor movement about how work in the health sector is organized. I'm part of an anti-authoritarian syndicate, and we will talk to different sectors on that. In the health sector, one of the crucial things we have dealt with is genome and human genome as modifying it as a way to prevent certain diseases, and what the implications of that are for both health work, research, and all the manufacturing of knowledge and drugs and all the stuff that's around it. Sorry if I don't have the right jargon in my answer.
Oh yeah, I had a question. Near the end of your talk, I didn't quite catch what you were saying, but related to how harm reduction is a function of capitalism, I think you were saying. Can you just like expand on that?
I have a lot of feelings about harm reduction. I've been working in it and as an advocate for a long time. But I do feel like the role of harm reduction, people who are in harm reduction are in it for like lots of different reasons. And there are people who have limited knowledge or understanding about drug policy, how it's rooted in racism or criminalization. We all come at it from different ways, which I'm learning since this year police somehow ended up in working with harm reduction workers in Toronto, which was like very, very fucked up. And that the fact that people didn't think that that was wrong, that there were people who said they worked for, liked harm reduction and thought harm reduction was important. I mean, there are people who think of it in terms of controlling what they deem as deviant behavior. So that in itself is a capitalist notion, controlling and intervening in people's lives to control people away from what people think is deviance. The way we see drugs in society, the fact that drug people have been using drugs for like thousands of years, and that we've created this like construct of harm, and that not all drugs are harmful, but the ways in which our system are set up create harm and also create harm in people's lives. So that in itself is capitalist. The drug war itself is, and I think that we in harm reduction, safe injection sites, for instance, could be points of surveillance. They could actually be a way of using public order to take people off of the street because we don't want to use social cleansing. So I helped to get safe injection sites, and I've been helping with that campaign. But I do have a really big criticism and fear of the way that they're being used. So there's an organization that touts itself as harm reduction based, and this just yesterday they can't deal with some of the stuff going on in their building. There's drug use going outside of their building. So what do? They get the police involved. So now the police have increased their presence in the east end of Toronto, and now have access to one of the buildings with keys to go inside that building whenever they want. And so these organizations say they're harm reduction. So they use it, but they're using it in a framework that isn't what it is. It's not to create more harm and criminalization. So I think as people working in harm reduction, we need to think of some other terms. We also need to give some, because we're already, by saying harm reduction, we're saying that there's inherently harm in using drugs. I want us to bring back the conversation of pleasure and talking about safer use. And so I think harm reduction has been caught up in this way that it's about behavior modification. We still look at it negatively. It's an entry point to abstinence, and so that in itself could be a capitalist logic.
Shifted to bodily autonomy.
Shifted to bodily autonomy. Yeah. Make it feminist. Intersectional. It lacks intersectionality, I'll tell you that. Working in harm reduction, there are way too many people who lack any sort of lens around race and class, and who have embraced it because they're like, I'll give someone a kit. I can get into that. I can reduce transmissions of HIV and Hep C. They don't think of it beyond that. It's not just about handing out a freaking kit. And this is the problem that we have in harm reduction, and it's very, very frustrating, to be honest. We're gonna wrap it up. Anyone else have anything else? I just hope that we can continue to have these dialogues. I'm really excited that people came out. I've been really shy personally about talking publicly about this because I don't know why. But I'm really excited to carry on conversations. We won't get it right. There are things we don't know, and that's the thing. It's okay. That's the thing about anarchism. and about us, because we're supposed to, you know, figure it out as we go and be able to like talk to each other and make mistakes and dialogue and just dream. I want us to dream aspirationally of like, you know, what next, what could be.
Thank you, everyone. If you wouldn't mind helping us with putting the chairs away, they get folded up and put in the corner.
But I will say that there's actually not a rush to leave.
Okay, so you can then go.
So just, you know, like, you know.
But when you say that, then people won't put the chairs away.
You know,
right now,
I would rather put away all the chairs and have people who are here talk to each other and have not the chairs. So take the time to talk
If you want to
to
come for a
people.
drink, come talk to
I can do the chairs.
The anticlimactic. So